Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today for Powder River Basin Resources Council webinar on reclaiming growing Wyoming's future. This is the first of 4 webinars that the Powder River Basin Resources Council is holding. Today's is dedicated to talking about Wyoming's reality and future opportunities. Just so you know, the session is being recorded. I'd also like to thank Monica and Michelle, who have done the yeoman's work of organizing this. My name is Larry Wolf. I live in Cheyenne. I've practiced law here for almost 40 years in the energy business and as a natural resources lawyer. The goal for this webinar is to start a deeper ongoing conversation about Wyoming's economy, as well as to provide, obviously, education, background, tools, and resources for a planned transition away from particularly the coal-dependent energy system that we have now to what the future energy supplies will hold. Our speakers, and we have 3 of them, will discuss Wyoming's current economic situation and identify opportunities and possible solutions for moving forward. The Powder River Basin Resources Council, who is hosting this, is a member-based grassroots organization that has been in existence since 1973. It's a family agricultural and conservation organization based in Wyoming. Members are from around the state and are concerned citizens committed to conservation of Wyoming's unique resources and including the promotion of responsible energy development and use. If you want to know more about the PRBRC, they have an excellent website at prbrc.org. We are really pleased today to have 3 speakers. I will introduce them, ask them to each make a presentation, which you'll be able to hear and view on your screen. And then we'll take a very short break, about 5 minutes, and then we'll have a long opportunities for questions and answers. We've had some questions that have already been submitted. We've also prepared questions that the panelists have been reviewing. If there are other questions, you can ask them in the question box, and then we'll look at them and we'll try to formulate the questions. We hopefully will get to all of them, but we may not. But there's obviously a huge amount of material to cover. Here are some brief bios of the speakers. Our first speaker is Rob Godbey. Rob is an associate professor at the economics department at the University of Wyoming. And he's also, and something near and dear to my heart, he's now the associate dean of the Hobbs School of Environment and Natural Resources. And I will tell you that I think Rob Godbey has contributed so much to this conversation about energy and economics with tremendous technical insight, but most of all, tremendous courage, and has spoken and given to the people and the policymakers of Wyoming information that they desperately need and sometimes may not like. So, but his contributions on this have really been outstanding now for many years. Rob serves as the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative Faculty Fellow. And most importantly, in the last couple of years now, he's been a member of the Consensus Revenue Estimating Group. And in that group, he has helped to advise the legislature and the governor's office and policymakers around the state on what the budget and the economic forecasts are for the state of Wyoming and how that should be evaluated in terms of planning and legislative activity. He's an expert in natural resources, energy, environmental economics, industrial organization, and macroeconomic policy. And you can find on the web just a terrific number of interviews that he's given, articles that he's written, and of course his contributions to the Craig process. He has passions in sports cars and bicycle racing. So that's Rob. Sharon Fain, who has been a longtime friend of mine and is a Rotarian in Cheyenne, has been the Rocky Mountain Vice President for Wyoming since July 1, 2019. Prior to that, she had a very successful consulting firm, and she got hired by Rocky Mountain Power to help structure their Energy Vision 2000 community outreach, and she's going to be talking more about that. She's had at least a decade in the energy industry, both in external affairs and governmental affairs, economic development, and communications. And she worked for 20 years as a national journalist. She's been deeply involved in economic development activities on the International Economic Development Council and with the Wyoming Economic Development Association. She has a BA in communications from Georgia State University and has taken further training at the Harvard Kennedy School Executive Education Program in Economic Development. Kurt Kaiser is with the federal government. He's an economic development representative with the U.S. Department of Commerce's Economic Development Administration for Montana and Wyoming. I started that position in March of 2015 after being involved in the National Credit Union Administration and working as a community program specialist for USDA rural development in Wyoming. Obviously has a deep background in rural communities and rural economic development. He served as a commercial lender with several community banks in Montana and with a rural cooperative. He's a Montana native and a graduate of Montana State University and loves the outdoors and hunting and fishing. Thank you, panelists, all of you, for giving your time and expertise to this, and look forward to your discussions. Rob?
Thanks for that, Larry, and I'll just wait for the screen invite to bring up my presentation. Thanks also for the kind comments, and thank you for letting me be here. I'm not sure that people always enjoy what I have to say, so hopefully that's not one of those days. But let's get to it. I guess my job today is to kind of give the background of where we are with respect to coal energy and the transition that's going on. Can everybody see my screen? Great. All right, so to start off with, coal has been facing really what we would call a structural decline for several years now. COVID has certainly taken a lot of our bandwidth away, but this has been ongoing, and it'll be true after COVID goes away. We can all hardly wait for that time. And really, the biggest problem that coal faces is that it's being squeezed out of the market for two reasons. The first is that it's not as competitive as it used to be. There's an aging fleet of coal-fired power plants that are no longer as efficient as they used to be. They're getting close to their retirement, and they need replacement. And of course, when you're thinking about investment, you want to think about the best way to make those multi-billion-dollar investments. And there are new players on the horizon here. Natural gas is now much cheaper in most places for the production of electricity, and renewables are as well. Both of those have developed in the past decade, and have really, as you'll see in a second, knocked coal kind of out of its historic preeminent position in electricity generation, not only in the state of Wyoming, but in the United States. The other problem that coal faces is the future. Coal, without controls like carbon capture, which are still largely unproven at commercial scale. They're beginning to be now. You have to figure out what to do with the CO2 emissions. And as those climate concerns become more and more serious, and they have become very serious in the past years, they will in the future, there's a real regulatory uncertainty here. So if you were to invest in a new coal-fired power plant, you're really pretty worried about whether you'll be able to use it, given the amount of carbon emissions that may occur at such a plant. So that's the cost side. But on the demand side, what people often forget is that people's preferences really matter here. We've seen several surveys where people's willingness to have electricity from renewables is very popular. Even in the state of Wyoming, recent surveys have shown that people favor renewables even more than coal generally across the state. And the reason people have those preferences is in part for concerns about cost and concerns about emissions. People are worried about the climate, and they're also worried about the basic emissions, which are well controlled now, but still exist from coal-fired power plants. Another way people's preferences show up is in politics. Things like state carbon limits, like that are shown in things like renewable portfolio standards. Those have now been around for decades. They have survived many states, different administrations from both sides of the aisle. Politically, they're very stable. It is not a partisan issue anymore. Renewables are popular across the board. And for that reason, again, people's preferences are shown both at the ballot box. They continue to vote for those initiatives, or at least keep those in power who support them. And they prefer them themselves. And in addition, utilities are reacting to those preferences. And so where there are not state initiatives like that, they will often create voluntary carbon limits. For example, Idaho Power has done that recently. So all of those reasons are kind of pushing coal out of the market. And if we look at what's happened over time, you can see this kind of 15-year picture. Coal 15 years ago produced over 50% of the electricity in the country. At the end of last year, that had fallen to around 24%, below 25%. So it had halved in 15 years, which in energy terms is kind of a seismic shock. As you can see from this graph, what primarily replaced it was natural gas. You can see hydro and nuclear were pretty flat, but kind of coming up from a very low start in 2005, renewables, primarily wind and solar, now play an ever more important role. And in 2020, combined hydro and wind and solar, so total renewables, will actually outproduce nuclear power, and as you'll see in a minute, coal. So if we kind of extend what we expect to happen into the future, and this is in part affected by the COVID crisis we're all facing, coal's decline has only been accelerated. This year, we expect coal's share of total electricity in the national economy to fall to only about 17%. As you can see, renewables grow, natural gas grows. So basically that share decline comes due to increases in natural gas and renewables. As we go out a little further, and this is a short-term forecast, we see that coal kind of has a rebound there, but that's not a permanent one. That's really related to changes in the oil industry, which we expect are going to reduce oil production and probably natural gas production in the shorter term, which will lead to higher gas prices. And for a little while, coal will get a reprieve. But as you can see from the green line, renewables just continue to accelerate in their share of the market. And that's what we really expect to continue going on. So that little reprieve we might see in 2021 is probably, it might be the last hurrah for coal before the steady decline continues. So what's really causing this coal decline? Well, I've already said it's natural gas and renewables. They're obviously taking the place of coal in the power market. But what this graph here is a picture of what we call the capacity factor, and that's how much people are using their coal-fired power plant relative to how much electricity it could produce. And that's called the capacity factor. So if you think of a coal-fired power plant that could produce 100% of its capacity 24/7, 365 days a year, it would have a capacity factor of 100%. Plants don't work like that. They have to go down for maintenance. If we look back a decade ago, coal-fired power plants were still operating at above 50% of their total capacity. And as you can see, the blue line shows that those fired by PRB coal, Wyoming coal, actually were much closer to 70% at the beginning of the decade. And if we add in all the other plants, they were much closer to 50%. And that really reflects the fact that Wyoming coal is both cheaper to use in power plants and also that it's lower sulfur, which reduces their costs. But what you can see with both lines as time's gone on is that that use of those coal plants has gone down. And the reason for that is because cheaper alternatives exist. And if you can generate power more cheaply, you'll do that first. You're required to as a regulated utility. And if you're in a deregulated market, market competition will force that. What you can see at the end of that picture is really what COVID has done. Really what's driven this decline is primarily natural gas. That dotted line I've just added is the price of natural gas that power plants pay. And you can see that coal goes up and down with natural gas prices. The problem is, since the advent of fracking around a decade ago, natural gas is cheap, plentiful, and really the market has been flooded. So we don't expect those prices to go back up significant, not nearly to what they were a decade ago, although we expect some variation with recent events. So that's really what we're facing here is people use their coal-fired power plants less. As they use a coal-fired power plant less, it becomes less profitable. They have very high what we call fixed costs. Regardless of whether you're producing product, you have to pay people to be there, you have fuel supplies, contracts you're locked into, and you just have to keep maintenance up. So when you get below that 50% category, what you begin to see is a lot of plants begin to think about retirement because they're just making continuous losses. And this capacity chart is really the reason why we've seen, over a third of coal-fired power plants, approaching a half if we look at capacity, now being retired in the United States. And that is a trend that will continue. You saw the natural gas price trend. The other problem that coal faces, and natural gas eventually may face this, is the declining cost of renewables. This is the cost of wind. And with wind, you don't worry so much about fuel because it doesn't use any. What you worry about is the investment cost. And that investment cost is, you kind of think about, what will the cost of this plant be per megawatt hour of electricity produced? You see there's a range there in every year. That's because different sites have different wind potential. And the more wind you have, for example, in places like Wyoming, the cheaper this is because there's a fixed cost to build the plant. And then you're going to make that back over time, over the life of the plant, with how much electricity it will produce. If you produce more, the average cost of that plant goes down. What you can see is, first of all, costs have really declined. They are now 70% lower than what they were before, and that is without subsidies. If you were to look at that last marker there, so at $28 a megawatt hour for wind, and you add the subsidy, that will drop it down in some cases down to about $15 or less on an average basis, which is much, much cheaper than how much it costs to operate a coal-fired power plant or even a gas-fired power plant. So what's this done to coal production? You can see in this picture, last 12 years, the heyday of the high point of coal production in Wyoming and the Powder River Basin, anyway, was in 2010, exactly 10 years ago now, where we produced over 400 million tons a year. As you can see, those red lines at the end are the CREG, the Consensus Revenue Estimating Group in Wyoming's projection. There are several projections, but you can go across the board and look. What is expected in the next 2 years and beyond is that doesn't go back up. The 197 million tons in 2020 is about a 70 million ton decline from what we did last year, which is really significant. And we don't expect that to rebound. And so this means that as a state, we face some real challenges, both at the community level and at the state revenue level. And those add to other challenges we face in the oil and gas sectors where we depend on revenue as well. So one of the problems that's occurred in Wyoming, and I've gotten in trouble for using this picture before, but Wyoming kind of hid from this reality for quite a while. People watching coal and recognizing new technologies have known that coal would be challenged in the future, or thought it would be. And there's been, there have been alarm bells rang before, and that's why I use this kind of hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. You could find a lot of people that would be skeptical of any concerns like that. And I think those really went away last year. So from 2010 to 2019, about a third of our coal output in Wyoming went away, just no more customers, and yet we had no mine closures. But then last year in May, we had the Cloud Peak bankruptcy. That was followed within a month with the two largest coal companies operating in the state telling us that they wanted to merge, which is not a good sign. Basically, what they've argued is in order to remain competitive, they need to merge their operations and actually consolidate some of their mines, which is a fancy way of saying shut them down. Black Jewel in July of last year had their bankruptcy that lost 600 workers their job for most of the summer and fall. They are now operating again, but on a reduced capacity. In October, Sharon may talk more about this, Pacificor announced that it was planning on retiring several coal plants in the state earlier than had originally been planned. And then finally, we have COVID-19. So within a year, from COVID all the way back to what seems decades ago, that Cloud Peak bankruptcy late last spring, coal has really been in the headlines, and they've not normally been good headlines, unfortunately. And that is, again, part of the reality that we face. So what is this decline going to do to Wyoming? As of last year, there were about 9,500 jobs that were directly related to coal, and also those in the supply chain, or those that depend on how people spend their money. We call those direct, indirect, and induced jobs. So about 9,500 jobs depended on coal mining in the PRB. That is not including rail generation. If we include those, it goes up to about 13,000. So there are about 13,000 jobs in the Powder River Basin that depend on coal. If you spread those out evenly across the households, there'd be about 3 coal jobs for every 10 households in the Powder River Basin. That is the broad area in northeastern Wyoming. That's pretty significant. So if we look at the declines that have occurred, last year we had a pretty significant decline, about 10% in coal production. And in the long run, that will result in about 400 fewer direct mining jobs being needed, and that will cause 400 fewer indirect jobs being needed, those that supply or support those jobs or depend on those incomes, people at restaurants or Walmarts who earn their living from the incomes of those people. It will also cost the state about $60 million a year in lost revenue. But now we're looking at COVID, and COVID represents about a 70 million ton decline. We only have about almost 3 times what we saw last year, which, again, if you look at kind of the production numbers up there and the average productivity of a miner, that would reduce employment up there by about 1,100 more miners and about 1,100 indirect jobs. So about 2,200 jobs could be lost due to the decline we're seeing this year. That could affect about 5% of the households in that region. And this will increase the cost of the state to about $160 million a year in revenues that are now gone. So those are really significant impacts to those communities in the Powder River Basin. But that's not the only place coal matters. The reason we talk about the Powder River Basin first is because the Powder River Basin produces about 40% of the country's coal, and about 96% of the coal in Wyoming is produced there. And we only use about 4% of that coal. Down in the southwest corner of the state, we also have coal mines, and those have been there for 100 years since statehood. They produce only about 4% of Wyoming's production, and they're used locally primarily at the power plants there. Because of the way those mines work, the lack of economies of scale that Powder River Basin mines have, they employ about 15% of our coal miners in the state. So we have about, as of last year, a little over 5,000 coal miners. So, that's a significant proportion, about 750 miners in that area. And so this is also important, not so much because of how much coal we produce, but how much those communities depend on these plants. In addition, those coal mines serve these coal plants, which are now looking at retirement. Jim Bridger 1 was announced in the Pacific Core IRP to retire around 2024, and you can see in brackets there the mines that will affect. In 2026, we would see the last 2 units at the Naughton Power Plant retire, which now account for most of the Kemmer mine's output. And so their closure of those units could potentially cause the closure of the Kemmer mine as well. Jim Bridger 1 wouldn't cause the closure of those other mines, but Jim Bridger 2 follows behind it. There are 4 units at Jim Bridger in 2029. And again, about half the coal in those mines would be eliminated. And in fact, we're expecting 2 mine closures in 2022, 2023, and then at the end of the decade at the Bridger mine, because that coal is just no longer needed. And then finally, the Dave Johnston plant, a retirement that everybody knew was coming. This is actually a scheduled date, is expected to retire in 2027. And these are going to have not only impacts on coal mines, but also impacts on the local communities as each of these plants close and a significant amount of employment disappears. So if we look at what the impacts could be of these reductions, and we can see right away that Naughton, if we look at 1 and 2, there are about 100 workers at the plant. If we assume that the Kemmer mine shut down as well, that could be another 200 workers. That's a pretty huge impact in a place with only about 1,100 households. That would additionally have about another 130 jobs lost in the local community that depend on those incomes or supplying. So about 450 jobs lost in a community, again, with only about 1,100 households, a little over 3,000 people. That's a pretty significant impact. If we look at Bridger simultaneously, that's not, we're looking at, when I say simultaneously, closing both units 1 and 2. That's pretty important. Of course, they're going to be staggered, but again, the job loss there could be about 624 jobs. I neglected to say in the last slide, if Naughton closes, there's a significant loss to state revenues, over $20 million. And the same occurs if we close the Bridger plants. Those are total tax revenues that we estimated last year. And again, these are preliminary numbers. We can't know exactly what happens, but we know these community impacts will be large. The Dave Johnston closure, which has been expected for quite a while now, again, there are about 200 workers there. There is not a mine associated with that, but the workers are spread across Casper, Glenrock, and Douglas. And again, there'd be about 500 job losses for that plant closing. The tax cost is a little bit lower, mainly because they use Powder River Basin coal, which doesn't cause as much tax revenue to be generated. And that's mainly because Powder River Basin coal is cheaper and coal is taxed on the value of production. But this is not insignificant. Again, that will affect 3 communities, and included in that effect on, the indirect effect is about 50 miners who would lose their jobs in the Powder River, or be unnecessary now in the Powder River Basin due to the fuel that wasn't being mined there. So the question is really, what can we do about this? And the answer is really not much, other than try to prepare and engage. The state has initially, if we think about, well, I should go back one step and say, we can think about policies that would affect the company. So what might Pacific Core be thinking about, and what would affect them? There has been legislative action to keep the plants open. Companies are now expected to try to put up their coal plants for sale before they retire them. So it is possible somebody else could operate them. The problem is this could be very costly. Coal plants are becoming less and less competitive. And the question is, what are the terms of that deal? Does it delay ratepayers, or that is the customers of the utility, from accessing cheaper power? And again, these are old power plants. And so the question is, how long would that be a solution? They won't last forever. So we can start thinking about what might happen with communities and the impacts they face. Now, this is an unexpected decision by a regulated utility that's been granted a monopoly in the state. There are precedents elsewhere for requesting company compensation, and in fact, PacifiCorp has offered to help these communities with their transitions. More importantly, though, is where will PacifiCorp put its new power? Because they'll have to replace these plants with new generation. And about $4 billion in investment is slated for Wyoming to replace that power. And really, there is no other sector now anywhere that is thinking about a $4 billion investment in Wyoming. So this is actually a great chance to diversify the economy and move to a fuel secure outcome where we could be producing electricity for, say, another several decades. There is also a very complicated way of helping, which is changing the way these plants are paid for and how you can earn funds from them. And so there is something called securitization, which is actually the topic of a future seminar, so I won't get into it now. But basically what you do is you sell these bonds that are funded by the ratepayer payments that would have gone to pay for those power plants. And you use some of those bond sales to bring funds back to support the communities. And this is the basis of two plans in New Mexico and Colorado as they face the same sort of energy transition we are. Of course, you can do all of the above. So those are some policies that could affect PacifiCorp or companies that are retiring power plants directly. Problems with PacifiCorp, that securitization idea, which gets a lot of play elsewhere, may be very difficult to do in Wyoming because PacifiCorp has a 6-state region. And in order to work, you would probably need buy-in by the other states. That's unclear that that would happen. And Wyoming's base may be too small to really make a difference. We are only about 15% of that group. So what else could we do? There could be direct state policy. Transition and energy impact funding from the state. Well, that'll be very difficult now with COVID-19, but it's something that we have talked about in the past. We have impact payments for development of energy. There has been consideration, although it's difficult to find the funds for, how do you fund communities that are facing energy impacts as the energy sector declines? Other sources, the abandoned mineland funds can be a useful source. They're already being used for coal transition. Are there other funds like that that we could look for? And then finally, tax policy could do this. We could use some tax revenues or new funds to fund this transition that we're facing, thinking of it as an investment. The other side is possibly more aggressive economic development, and Kirk may talk more about that. The bottom line, though, is we really need to think about that transition planning. And we can give support in the form of funds or support. These communities, they're often very small. They often need capacity. And so supporting capacity and planning at the community level is really important. You need more community positions at a time when local revenues are going to be challenged. We need the support to actually help them in the planning process, to create access to economic development options and ideas and development strategy. One thing that has also been talked about, a little different, is reclamation. When you close a mine or you close a plant, you have to reclaim it. That means for several years there will be good jobs as that plant or mine is torn down or reclaimed. That can also create good jobs. And then finally, education policy and retraining is clearly potential opportunities for these communities. Finally, a few other development strategies that the state's looked at. We could look at coal as an asset that we don't want to lose. Commercial scale carbon capture and storage is not really that large. There's really only one commercial power plant in the United States, another in Canada that do it. There's a lot of development that needs to be done, and it turns out that Johnston may be a perfect site for that. So could the state somehow leverage funds from the federal government through possible matching funds to create that development here? Not only would that research occur that might benefit some coal plants elsewhere, but it would also benefit the communities where they exist. And finally, can we talk about that renewable development? Renewable development is a huge opportunity. Right now, Wyoming is 18th in the country, even though arguably we have the best onshore winds. But we have the 18th most wind capacity in the state. We have a lot of development underway already. Pacific Core is working at almost another 1,500 megawatts of capacity ongoing. And we have the Chokecherry Sierra Madre plant, or project down in southern Wyoming, which would be about another 3,000 megawatts. We could see total wind development in Wyoming, our capacity, increase by a factor of 3. And there are a lot of good jobs both in the construction of those plants and in the operation of them once they're done. They won't replace the lost jobs from coal, and that's part of the reason renewables are so much more cost effective, is they use less people. But they are a very good way of diversifying our economy and also looking towards the future and maintaining our place as an energy producer. So with that, I just say that we need to start planning. Despite the fact that COVID has kind of taken all of our bandwidth, this is going on in the background. It's going to go on after COVID is over. And the state is already involved in this. The governor's office has been looking at this for a couple of years now, since Governor Gordon's administration began. There are also local groups looking at this, but what we really need to do is focus even more effort in this area, because there are some really difficult decisions and realizations that we need to come to terms with. Coal mining is part of Wyoming's identity, and unfortunately it may be going away. So how do we change? It won't be easy, but we have to act. And with that, I'll turn this back over to everybody in the group. So thank you.
Rob, thank you very much. That was a wonderful overview of a very, very complex set of issues. Just for all of the people on the webinar, we had almost 130 people registered for this, including many legislators and public officials, and obviously public interest groups and lobbying groups. And so we appreciate all of you joining us, and it's a stellar group of attendees, so thank you very much.
Can you see my screen and hear me as well?
Yes, we can.
Great. So thanks everyone and all the attendees. My name is Kirk Kaiser. I'm the representative from the Economic Development Administration, and I represent EDA in Montana and Wyoming. So EDA's overall mission is economic development for the federal government, and our whole mission is about job creation, job retention, diversification, and resiliency sort of projects across the nation. Our region is the Denver region, so you can see where the star is. We cover 10 states that are covered by Denver, basically Montana to Missouri and the Dakotas and Iowa to Utah. We have several different programs, but the ones I'm going to primarily focus on are our implementation funding that we have available. Those two buckets are called economic adjustment assistance as well as public works. We do have a planning program. There's a district or a network of districts across the nation. Unfortunately, there aren't currently any funded districts in Wyoming, but for instance, Montana has 10 regional economic development entities that help promote and provide capacity for the region for economic development activities. We fund them with a grant of up to $70,000 a year on an ongoing basis. It's typically a 50-50 match, which is our overall theme of match funding needed for EDA. This is an ongoing basis and helps provide lots of capacity to the area. We also have a short-term planning and local technical assistance grant, which is more on the planning side for doing sort of region-wide planning as well as feasibility studies and those sort of things. So who is eligible? Essentially, it's anyone but a for-profit company. So it could be a state, could be a local town or county government, universities, tribes, and nonprofits. Our planning funding doesn't have any requirements for distress, but our public works and economic adjustment assistance do. There's got to be a way to open what I call our eligibility gate. And the two primary ways we look at that are the 24-month unemployment needs to be at least 1% higher than the national average, or the per capita income for the area needs to be 80% or less of the average. We also have a special needs section that has a rather wide variety of options to open the gate. For instance, closures and major layoffs from employers in an area, military installation closures, presidentially declared disaster declarations, opportunity zones are another way, and then most recently the COVID-19 pandemic, with President Trump naming the nation as a declared disaster, opened the gate for nationwide eligibility. So it's less of a factor now. Our basic grant rate is 50-50, but it can go up to 100% grant. I've rarely seen over 80%, but it actually is a possibility. So our public works section, the name pretty much says it all. It's going to be something that helps revitalize, expand, and upgrade physical infrastructure and promote job creation and private investment in an area. The traditional things would be water, sewer. I think a more modern sort of infrastructure might be broadband and those sort of things. Our Denver regional allocation usually is between $8 to $10 million a year. And roughly our typical investment is right in that $1.5 million range. There is no minimum or maximum. Truly, it's the budget that we get and trying to spread the funds out geographically that would be the limiting factors. The economic adjustment assistance funding is very similar to the public works, but it actually truly is more flexible. Most likely an economic adjustment assistance funded project could be funded under public works too, so it just truly is kind of a EDA discretion on which bucket it's going to come from. But this can be used also for revolving loan funds, for planning activities as well. We get a smaller pot of funding for this. It's that $2.5 to $4 million range. And then naturally the asks here are a little smaller just because the bucket of money is smaller. So average there is about $820,000. We do have a bucket of funding that's part of that EAA, and I don't want people to get too caught up on which bucket, because truly there's two main buckets. There's planning funding and there's implementation funding, and that's probably all you need to remember. But under that EAA bucket, we have a subset that's for only coal impacted areas, and it's called Assistance to Coal Communities, or ACC funding. I believe for the last 5 years, under the previous administration, it was called POWER. When we got the current administration, we got to change names. So the new name for that POWER grant became Assistance to Coal Communities, but essentially it's the same line item on the budget. Our Denver region gets roughly $3 million each fiscal year for this. So if there are coal impacted projects in the area, I definitely would like to visit about them. The most recent one funded in Southwest Wyoming was for Kemmer. I believe it was last year. They applied for a diversification strategy as well as a diversification coordinator that grant is currently underway. I will bring up the COVID-19, the CARES Act funding, which everyone's heard of. EDA was tasked with getting out $1.5 billion, and that's with a B, of funding. This is a significant bump in the funding level of what EDA typically sees. We usually get 200 to 300 million a year, so it looks like it's roughly 7 times. But the 1.5 billion quickly becomes 193 million that came to the Denver regional office. Out of that 193 million, roughly 130 of it was designated as non-competitive funds to economic development districts, tribes, current revolving loan fund grantees, as well as the university centers. So that leaves roughly 60-ish million left for the competitive side. And truly, the demand is probably likely going to exceed the pot of funding we have, but the key is having a nexus to COVID-19 so that as a result of a project EDA would fund, the area will be more resilient as a result of it to a COVID-like situation in the future. So if you can answer that question and have a clear nexus, I would definitely, again, definitely recommend reaching out to me and discussing the project. I have some examples of projects here. It's truly the flavor EDA is involved with is similar to the Wyoming Business Council in their Business Committed program. We can't necessarily do the Readiness Community Grant Fund that the Business Council has because that's more of a potentially build it and they will come. We do need to have a committed beneficiary that says, as a result of EDA's investments, company X will create X number of jobs or retain X number of jobs along with private investment. But an example here was Interbell Telephone Co-op in northwestern Montana, got a grant from us last year, or actually it's a couple of years ago, for roughly $600,000 to put a broadband fiber loop through their business district in Eureka, Montana. Campbell County received funding for the Ice Pick project you may have heard about. It's basically an incubator for coal-related technologies for alternative uses for coal. I believe that one was funded last year. But there can be a wide range from workforce training to infrastructure to incubators to recovery strategies or a coordinator like we did for Kemmer. Basically, and my last point there is truly it's what's needed at the local level to make an area more diversified and resilient. And as long as the project has characteristics around job creation and retention and private investment, I would recommend thinking EDA. And I guess with that, I would turn it back over. There's my contact information if anyone needs it. I don't know that we're taking questions now, but maybe after Sharon presents. So thanks.
Okay. So, is everything working? Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Great. So appreciate joining you this afternoon. And truly, every time we listen to Dr. Godby, we all learn something new and truly appreciate his input and evaluation of our energy economy in the state. And also Kirk's comments about how Kemmer has been assisted by the EDA grants, which we'll go through as well through our presentation. So I'd like to just a quick overview of PacifiCorp. PacifiCorp has two divisions that include Rocky Mountain Power and Pacific Power. We serve 6 states for electricity, as you can see, Utah, Wyoming, and Idaho, specifically for Rocky Mountain Power, and then Washington, Oregon, and California for Pacific Power. We are the largest electric utility in the state of Wyoming and serve 1.9 million electric customers throughout our service territory for PacifiCorp. Rocky Mountain Power, we have about 141,000 Wyoming employees, Wyoming customers. 75% of our generation goes to serve our industrial customers. A lot of activity, obviously, in the Trona Patch in southwestern Wyoming. And we have about 1,300 employees currently in Wyoming and more than 700 retirees. We'd like to really talk about and show you a video that we've produced that honors not only the history of coal and thermal generation in the state of Wyoming, but the people who really have made Wyoming the national player in energy in our nation.
Wyoming powers the nation. That's been true for generations. From the early coal mines that fueled the steam engine trains that knit our nation together, to the massive power plants that electrified vast territories across the West and beyond. None of that would have been possible without the people of this great state. People whose hard work creates opportunity. People who give so much, not just to their jobs, but to their communities. Nothing about this state is small, and Wyoming is playing a major role in shaping our country's energy future. Rocky Mountain Power is walking that journey with you, investing more than $3 billion in expanded wind power across the state, helping to strengthen Wyoming's transmission infrastructure, partnering with local companies to improve roads and bridges, creating jobs and tax revenue now, and laying the foundation for continued growth for years to come. Wyoming will always power the nation by educating tomorrow's engineers, builders, and inventors, by harnessing its rich resources, and by building the foundation that allows all of our communities to reach their true potential.
So I hope that gives you a visual of really what the history of Wyoming's energy industry is, honoring that tradition, as well as what we're looking at in the future to be able to provide reliable and low-cost energy to our customers. As Dr. Godby had mentioned, really Wyoming for us, it's a pivotal moment. We are looking at changing market conditions that he reviewed, also some environmental mandates, and increasingly customers are demanding low emission energy from their utilities. This is also specific to economic development as we look at companies who are evaluating whether to relocate in Wyoming or expand. They are also asking for a lower carbon footprint and our partnership with them in providing renewable energy. The Integrated Resource Plan, that is for those of you who may not be familiar with it, our utility or utilities every 2 years file a plan that looks ahead on what resources we're going to need, whether it's developing new infrastructure, how can we continue serving our customers most effectively. The most recent Integrated Resource Plan was proposed and filed in 2019. It included $3 billion of investment, included new wind, transmission, energy storage, and natural gas, and also some solar. There's an estimated tax revenue of several millions dollars, as well as revenues 25 to 40 million annually for some of the communities that are involved with our new developments, specifically wind and repowering. And of course, this moving forward is really contingent upon resource drivers and state policy decisions and regulators. The benefits of our investments specifically in Wyoming is we have about $70 million in estimated tax revenues during the construction and development of these projects, about 14 million in annual estimated tax revenues to the communities and state, and we're looking at about 1,200 construction jobs. Each month we have a report that comes out, and just recently this month we have 1,224 construction jobs on the ground in the primary project areas, specifically Carbon County. And once these projects are stood up and everything's completed, we're looking at about 200 plus full-time jobs related to this expansion in Wyoming. The investment components we're looking at for the state include new wind, which you've heard about, upgrading our existing wind turbines. We call it repowering, which increases the capacity and the output of those wind turbines up to 35%. And infrastructure development. A couple of photos here of one of the transformers that recently arrived in Wyoming to go support one of the substations that are part of this investment just outside Medicine Bow, Wyoming. Our new wind projects include the Cedar Springs in Converse County, our TB Flats project in Carbon County, as well as the 250 megawatt Echo Flats project also in Carbon County. The repowering process we mentioned earlier upgrades our existing turbines. You can see a map here that gives you an indicator of the current wind farms that Rocky Mountain Power and Pacificorp are operating. All of these wind farms that are indicated on the map will go through the repowering process. And again, we anticipate seeing about 35% more energy production from those same assets. And the repowering really, it's the process maintains the footprint of the current wind park, but removes the nacelles and the blades and replaces them with more technologically advanced infrastructure to increase that capacity and that production. Included in the Energy Vision 2020 project is the Gateway West transmission line. It's 140 miles of 500 kV line going from the Aola substation up in near Johnston there in Converse County down to an area near the Bridger Power Plant there in Sweetwater County. And you'll see from the map here the projected line and the map of the area that will host that transmission line.
Sharon, we're actually not seeing the map. Maybe you can try to pull back up your PowerPoint or something.
Are you seeing the PowerPoint?
We're seeing the PowerPoint, but not the slide you're talking about.
Okay. We'll troubleshoot that. I want to move on. I know that we're we're concerned about time, and I want to go through, and I can bring that back up at the end. I'm afraid I might lose the connection here. Infrastructure investments specific to Ecola Flats. We were able to support and construct a new bridge. The Ecola Flats Bridge and Road, as you can see from the photo here, this is the new bridge and infrastructure we were able to support the community with as we developed the local substation. This bridge was completed in 2018. We also resurfaced 10 miles of the county road there in Carbon County. And this is just an example of the construction to support Gateway West in this project. So a perfect example of how this investment in Wyoming is contributing to the counties that are involved in the project area. As Dr. Gabi had mentioned earlier, we have identified coal units to be retired. As you can see, Jim Bridger, Naughton 1 and 2, Dave Johnston, Jim Bridger 2, and Jim Bridger 3 and 4. Something that we would like to mention is Naughton 3 back in 2019 was converted to natural gas, and that is located in Cameron, Wyoming, that Kirk had mentioned, the community that is very engaged in identifying opportunities to transition and develop economic opportunities in that community. We are working with our bargaining units at all the power plants to develop a transition plan for employees. For us, our mission and our commitment is 0% job loss. And what we're, in a way to achieve that, we're providing educational opportunity and paying for college and additional education for our employees. That program is underway, and we hope that our employees who will take part in that to identify new opportunities. We are also working with training and relocation of any employees that are impacted during this transition, and also providing a priority hiring opportunity. So when we do have job openings across Berkshire Hathaway Energy, that those that may be impacted by the coal transition are considered a high priority for hiring on those positions. We are positioned to respond to the marketing conditions. We are continuing to invest in Wyoming. We are connecting more customers and communities to renewable energy as part of this plan. And really, we're supporting the communities that are involved in the projects, and also communities across the state with job development. And we are dedicated to a culture of innovation and partnership with not only our customers, but our employees and communities impacted by all of our plans for expansion and transition. And that's it for the PowerPoint. And again, I look forward to answering questions you may have as we wrap up. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sharon, and all three of you. Those were great discussions. I want to pose a question to Kurt, and then a question to Sharon and Dr. Godby together. Kurt, what are you seeing as sort of successful models that communities are doing to facilitate a transition away from coal, and in particular, I mean, communities like Kimmerer, but also has your agency been involved at all in trying to provide assistance in Colorado and New Mexico for their very similar situations?
I don't know that I can necessarily speak for New Mexico and Colorado because I focus primarily on Montana, Wyoming, but I know EDA is willing to focus on and assist any area that has the distress, not only with the assistance to coal community funding, but also our regular funding. So I've seen everything from a revolving loan fund stand up to feasibility studies to like the ice pick project we talked about up in Gillette, Campbell County. So it's truly whatever's at the local level. I look at us as being a tool in the toolbox to help implement what they need to help diversify and make the area more resilient.
Great. Rob and Sharon, it looks like the legislature and the governor's office are putting more of a focus on what's now called the Wyoming Energy Authority. They made a presentation to the Minerals Committee the other day. I don't want to dive into the politics of that so much as to say there really hasn't been, I'd like to focus a bit on solar, which is, there really isn't any focus within the state, it appears, on industrial scale solar. We have one project out in Rock Springs area, I know. Is that something that Wyoming has an opportunity to do and could be doing things to help develop, regulate, incentivize industrial scale solar?
Gary, this is Sharon. I'd like to follow up with what Kirk said, if you wouldn't mind, about economic development in the communities. Specific to Kemmerer, we provided $50,000 to match an EDA fund that I'm sure Kirk was the one who helped administer, and that was also matched by the Wyoming Governor's Office. So we truly appreciate the Governor's Office stepping forward and understanding that these type of funds are needed for communities that are being impacted by the coal transition. We recently just spoke with Brian Muir, who is the city manager in Kemmerer, and they are really, really dedicated to executing their diversification plan and have an RFP out now, trying to identify that specific person that Kurt mentioned to execute that plan. So we are truly engaged with the communities. We are very engaged with Kemmerer and truly appreciate them being forward as they look ahead to what that community needs.
Okay. Kurt, do you have anything else on that issue?
No, I think she covered it well. We were a partner in that grant, and truly our projects are driven from the local level. So it's truly what the locals would like, as long as it fits in our mission and the investment priorities that we have slated for us. Like I said, we're a tool in the toolbox.
Okay. I'll come back to the solar question for Sharon and Rob. But one community that doesn't get much discussion is Wheatland, which has Laramie River Power Station there, which is about the same age, built in the 70s. Rob or Sharon, do you know what's its planned future?
Well, I can say that there is no, so the Laramie River Station works a little differently from the other power plants in the state. It actually provides merchant power across the West. And so really that plant's operation is a little different from what you'd see in a utility environment. As far as I know right now, the retirement date for that plant is still a couple decades away. The capacity factors are reasonable at that plant. One of their generators has got a relatively low capacity factor, but I can't say whether that's just a maintenance issue right now. But the other two generators have been producing power. An interesting thing about the Laramie River Station is it's a funny station. It sits in Wheatland, which is about the center of Wyoming, but it actually has 3 generators. One of them is actually in the eastern grid, so there's actually a dedicated line that goes across the grid space over to the eastern grid, and so that generator actually it's not physically in the eastern grid, but electrically speaking, it is there. So they actually serve different markets. They depend on electricity needs across kind of the West and also the Midwest. And so really what that plant is dependent on is in part market conditions, but the market conditions can vary just because of how its operation works. For now, we've not heard anything about a retirement on that plant, but as times change, that could change as well.
Do you want to tackle the solar question and comments on that, both of you?
I don't know, Sharon might have a little to add. I mean, certainly Pacific Core has identified, or Rocky Mountain Power has identified several solar opportunities in Wyoming, and their IRP has actually identified, several hundred megawatts, I think, that could be developed in the next 15 years. So there's definitely opportunity in the state. Most of our focus has been on wind because our wind resource is significant, whereas solar resources in this part of the country are a little harder to compete with solar in, say, the Southwest or Southern Utah. But there's definitely that solar potential here. We're certainly not poor for solar. So maybe Sharon would want to just comment on, there's some significant plans for potential investment there.
There is, and thanks, Dr. Gabi, for mentioning that. So we're seeing a majority of solar development and discussions by key stakeholders, mainly in southwestern Wyoming. So, for us, the IRP has identified solar as well as battery storage as a component of the 2019 IRP as we move forward. But again, we're involved in discussions, and solar is definitely a potential component for our investments.
And Larry, I'm just gonna, this is Monica, I'm just gonna butt in here and let you know that we have a lot of attendees sending in questions that I'm sending to your email. So keep that in mind and check them. A lot of curious people out there.
You want to just read those, because I'd have to go back to my email, and well, I suppose I could do that. I can look at it from some other source. Okay, well, that's good to know.
I can start off on one if you want, while you get your email loaded. So let's see here. Kirk, could you comment on what constitutes a beneficiary business for your grants?
So the example I give is, and it doesn't need to be this company, it doesn't need to be this size, but say on the edge of Kemmer, Boeing wanted to come and build planes, and the town needed to extend water, sewer, and a road. EDA would be all over trying to help Kemmer with extending that infrastructure out there, or if it was to a business park or something like that. So the beneficiary needs to be some sort of a for-profit business that, as a result of our investment, plans to create a certain number of jobs and some amount of private investment over a 9-year period.
Great, thank you. Larry, do you have the questions available now on your email?
I do, yep. So let me, what are the potential hurdles to the projected increase in renewable energy sources as to power source usage? I guess, I mean, maybe embedded in that is this question about whether customers can in fact choose between generation sources when they're making annual choices. In some places, we've got that for natural gas in parts of the state. Is that something that we think we might see in the renewables industry? Rob or Sharon, you have a view on that? Or?
You go ahead and then I'll follow up.
Sorry, so I was just going to say that there is that choice that's available elsewhere. In a utility regulated sector, it really depends on how you set that up. You know, you could make those, we kind of have renewable, well, we had the old Blue Block program, I guess, Pacificor had, or Rocky Mountain Power had for quite a while. So it is a useful way to think about it. Certainly that is a way that market preferences can be exercised. However, it really depends on the areas and how that works. It can be difficult to implement in some utility areas just because of the impact it has on other ratepayers. If you have specific sources of power producing for specific users, because they're using, you know, the utility infrastructure as it is. So it can be complex, but it can be done, and it's certainly a way to show support or to express your preference for particular types of power. We certainly see that in some other ways in, say, the Colorado market, where some industries, for example, in Fort Collins are using what they claim, you know, they're using renewable power, or they are actually sponsoring the use of renewable power is more usually how it works. So that power is on the system somewhere, although they may not be receiving the green electrons directly to their facility.
So with the development, you know, the infrastructure and the renewables that we're installing, it's definitely a consideration. You know, this is the time for innovation and innovative thinking. We're really have unprecedented times with the pandemic and with the challenges the state is facing. I think utilities, it's an important time to be innovative and consider, you know, what our customers do really want as their energy that they use. And for us, you know, renewable energy credits, they've, you know, been a topic of discussion for several years for utilities. And again, you know, it's something to consider and revisit as we move forward with these renewable investments.
Hey, a couple more questions. Actually, several more have come in. Sharon, there's a question about what happens to the closed power plants? What are Rocky Mountain Power's responsibilities for handling those?
Yeah, as Dr. Gabi had alluded to, Senate File 159, as we move through the legislature and the regulatory process, those plants will be put up for sale. A good faith effort to sell those as required by the new legislation. And then we'll move forward as they're on the market and those discussions become available. But again, there are challenges ahead, but we are respectful and understand our role in making sure that we meet those obligations at the legislative and at the regulatory level.
Then does Rocky Mountain Power have reclamation obligations for those plants?
They do. Reclamation and decommissioning and recycling. I mean, there's a huge and long-term process that goes along with the closure and transition of a coal plant. One coal plant that I was involved in several years ago, I mean, the process took about a year and a half, 2 years. to remediate that area. And you know, something that not many folks know about Rocky Mountain Power, our Glenrock Wind Park is built and constructed on top of a reclaimed coal mine, the only one in the nation that we're aware of. And CBS Evening News came and did a really good piece on how that reclamation took place, and now moving from coal mining to wind, and on top of that reclaimed coal mine. So for us, it's a good story to tell, that we have an environmental responsibility and understand that this is a process as we go through the coal transition and changing out the coal plants and meeting, again, our legislative and regulatory mandates.
Rob, do you have anything you want to add to that, or should I pose another question to you?
I'm glad to answer another question. I can't really add to, you know, Sharon is the expert. I bow to her at Rocky Mountain Power.
Well, here's one for both of you. Today's Cheyenne paper has an article about what's going on in Albany County with wind development, and a proposal to the county commissioners for what appear to be much more stringent wind regulation. What do you think of Wyoming's regulatory structures now for wind development?
Go ahead, Rob.
So again, you're talking about the specific issue in Albany County, where the county is actually looking at revisiting some of its permitting rules. The rules in Wyoming are really not much different from many parts of the country. In fact, there is, you know, I was about to say reasonable. I suppose that's in the eye of the beholder. We certainly have different layers of regulatory oversight depending on the areas that you're thinking of. One of the issues that's come up here is whether county regulations are in line with state regulations. And those kind of overlaps can be problematic to developers as they try to sort through meeting obligations to both a local governance or ordinance, and also a statewide one. So the most important thing I would say from, you know, a developer's perspective, not being a developer, but speaking about it academically, is that, you know what you're facing. And so the regulations have to be clear, and hopefully they're coordinated. The reason to have a coordinated set of regulations is to ensure that you don't end up with either a race to the bottom, or that you can exclude unintentionally certain developments. So I don't know that answers your question. There is nothing of serious concern in citing regulations right now. There are things that we could think of in addition to this. Have been involved in efforts to try to talk about coordinating decisions in the future, to try to maybe incentivize particular places that maybe the state has decided might be better developed, and to protect others. Certainly the Friedenthal administration affected that with transmission corridors they defined back in the first decade of the 2000s. So it is helpful that you get that guidance in the future, but it has to be well communicated.
And for us, specifically for Albany County, for us, it's a watch and see. We really do look forward to seeing, you know, and hearing from both sides their perspective on wind development in Albany County, and we'll be evaluating that once the decision's made by the county commissioners.
Well, I mean, one of the issues always with wind, and I don't think the state has really grappled with, is one you just mentioned, Rob, which is citing concerns, and are there some overriding state interests in this, particularly viewshed protection? That's the one we hear most about, but there are other considerations too. Do you think Wyoming should try to embark on a sort of more higher level statewide effort on siting, because right now siting is incredibly ad hoc. I mean, the private companies, other than Pacific Core and maybe Power Company Wyoming, just have sort of decided this is where we're going to build because this is where we can get the land and put up the turbines and have access and all the other considerations. But well, we've got several questions. Are there broader considerations that perhaps would indicate that a state siting level undertaking would be beneficial?
It's a tough question to answer because siting is so complicated. So certainly I've been involved in trying to talk about how we might think about siting more widely. But there is the problem of we've kind of taken a step back. The broadest control that we had really for siting was the Friedenthal administration's effort to identify sage-grouse protected areas and transmission corridors through those areas. And it wasn't just for renewable development, but also oil and gas. At this point, we kind of face a tricky situation in the sense that we have developers out there, we have private landowners. We certainly have concerns regarding species issues, fragmentation of habitat. In addition, we have viewshed concerns. That's a lot of that we're hearing in Albany County right now with some of the neighbors to a proposed wind project. Those are all issues that are really difficult to get in front of when the development is already occurring. In some ways, and we've had these conversations before, it would really be useful probably to try to get ahead of that, to identify projects in the future and where you might want to see them occur. But simultaneously, you have to respect, people's rights and investment that's already been made during this last decade, where that type of siting planning didn't really exist. So how do we work into those plans, existing plans that are maybe already in development? So it is a tough question. It's one that's that we could solve, and we should have. A couple of years ago at the university, we convened a conference exactly to talk about these issues, and we were hoping that they would move forward. Rocky Mountain Power has, in the past, been very open to some of the suggestions, but the bottom line is we don't have that program going on right now, but we do have wind development going on, and so you have to be very careful about how you implement regulations in an environment where development is already occurring. Where there is probably potentially a lot more opportunity to get that off the ground would be in the solar area, and you mentioned that already, because solar development is much less common in the state, and so at that point we might be able to adapt plans more quickly, and it may be a little bit easier just because there may be a little bit less invested interest already involved, but certainly planning for renewable investment would be wise. I would just mention also, though, it's sometimes very difficult to bring planning up in a place like Wyoming because planning sounds a lot like zoning, and you don't mention that word in some places, or you do so very carefully when you're treading out in the West.
Sharon, do you have any other comments on that? And are any of these discussions in Albany County, do they affect your plans?
For us, again, it's a wait and see. We're in the time, everyone, where we're seeing unprecedented energy development in Wyoming, and we're open to, again, conversations and innovative thinking to move forward with these projects. It's a very large, multi-billion-dollar investment, job creation, taxes, tax support for the smaller rural communities, and Kirk's familiar with economic development challenges in rural communities. These projects really are focused in providing tax revenue, tax base for those communities during this very challenging time. So again, we're open to any conversation and innovative ideas when it's related to energy development in Wyoming.
Great. I've got a question which can be basically formulated this way, which is, do you see any prospects for nuclear development and nuclear power in Wyoming? There are discussions of small modular reactors, thorium reactors, and I don't want to spend much time on this, but if you have any immediate reactions or insights, that'd be great.
So we have had some discussions on small modular and potential for those type of developments. You know, for us, we're focused on the Energy Vision 2020 and 2023 in Wyoming. But again, any new energy innovation, anything that could help us provide the lowest cost energy for our customers that is environmentally responsible, we're all ears and at the table in those discussions. So I just don't think really, I'd like Rob's input on this too, with the uranium resources we have in Wyoming, the ability to support that, that industry, I think is important once the technology is financially viable and makes sense for our customers, we're at the table.
That in any of your work and analysis that you're venturing into?
There we go. I was muted there for a sec, Larry. So nuclear comes up a lot. The challenge with nuclear is, first of all, cost. It is expensive to develop nuclear under existing technologies. The second thing is licensing and approvals at the federal level. New technologies are potentially possible that could be used in Wyoming, but in order to be developed in Wyoming, they would have to go through a significant approval process, which is not something that's done in a short period of time. So when we're talking about things like thorium reactors, there's certainly potential there, but it's very difficult to see those developed. And for a company like Rocky Mountain Power or Pacific Core, it's difficult to put those into the planning when you don't know what the regulations are around them, you don't know what the costs are around them, and you don't know what the time frame is that they will be available. Modular reactors are being developed. There's a test proposal that'll occur in Idaho. We could see those reactors being licensed in the next maybe 3 to 5 years. If that were to occur, then it would really depend on the cost of those developments, or whether there was a developer willing to step up to make significant investment. But they're certainly on the table. The problem with nuclear is that conventional nuclear is just not, it's just really hard to make a case for that, a business case right now in a place like Wyoming when you have other alternatives that are more affordable. And that comes down to, you know, what are people going to end up paying for their power? And so in the near term, we probably won't see any nuclear development here, but certainly many people think that nuclear power is something that we will see more of developed in the next decades to come. And we could be talking about the next wave of development, seeing a lot of nuclear options. We just don't know. But it's really hard to imagine nuclear happening in the next 5 years here. And, you know, the earliest that probably it could really get started in Wyoming would be at the end of, you know, its current decade.
Thanks. I'm just scrolling through the questions. One of the things we haven't really seen the Wyoming legislature do is any really directed programs and significant funding for the kinds of community transitions. Why do you think that is? I mean, I think I can envision a number of reasons, but you know, the bills that have, for instance, imposed the burden potentially on Pacific Core and other utilities to find buyers and make arrangements with them are all intended to sort of prolong the life of these coal-fired power plants. And I've heard from legislators, well, if we just keep them going 5 years or 8 years, you know, again, without getting into divisive politics, I mean, is that a strategy that, you know, really makes sense from, you know, an economic standpoint, or should we actually be doing, we the state, be doing a lot more to work with Kurt and the federal government on trying to help workers transition to renewable energy jobs and make other kinds of transitions that will keep these communities at least solvent, if not vibrant? That may be too difficult to answer.
Well, I don't know. I guess I could say this, Larry, that there are kind of two approaches. And it really depends on where you are. If you're an energy producing state, it is very difficult politically to move away from interests that have been supported and naturally surround portions of the economy that you've leaned on heavily, and certainly we lean on fossil fuels very heavily. The second thing is, so there's a political element there, certainly. And the second problem that we face is, you know, the real time to start planning for that is before you're in economic trouble. And it becomes much more difficult to free up resources like that in a meaningful way when you're already facing structural deficits, which we have been facing the past few years. And of course, COVID makes it that much more difficult in the future. And so, you know, ignoring the politics for a bit, which I think is really the answer, because if you are accepting that, as we all know, climate and energy has been a very partisan issue for quite a while now. And so to take a side on this could certainly leave you at risk. But all that aside, I think we've just lost a lot of time there. Certainly, we could be planning for transition in ways that, say, New Mexico and Colorado have. We could be talking, you know, so for example, Colorado has created an office of transition to actually manage those sorts of things. But it will be difficult now, that regardless of whether we did enough or not prior to this, it will be very difficult now, given the challenges the state faces, where we simultaneously face structural decline in say fossil energy and the revenue decline, that the first task is probably trying to get our heads around our tax structure in the state, which is a whole other topic. But as our revenues decline, it just makes those resources much more difficult to marshal for anything, much less helping particular communities in the transition.
Go ahead, Sharon.
I think to follow up on that and just remember some of the slides that we reviewed about the cost of each fuel. You know, we are truly fuel agnostic. We are mandated and required to offer the lowest cost energy available to our customers. So for us, again, we saw the cost of renewables go down compared to the cost of continuing the operations of our coal fleet. again, our responsibility is to try to provide the lowest cost resource and energy that we can to our customers.
And I'm glad you made that and emphasized that point, Sharon, because that's such a critical point, is that you've got 140,000 customers and their desires. They may say they like renewable energy, and they may say they like coal, but the reality is what they really like is what they think are reasonable and fair energy costs. And that's what drives our whole sort of public utility bargain between the monopoly companies and the consumers in the state. So, Kurt, go, Rob.
I'd just add to that, to be really clear, our state has a lot of really tough questions in front of it, and they're related. We have an energy decline. We know that the markets for our fossil fuels are diminishing, and our long-term outlook is that they're not as valuable as they were before. We simultaneously have a tax system that depends on those revenues. There's a famous study that the Wyoming Taxpayers Association did where, if you look at a family of 3 in Casper with their child in school, they receive about $27,000 in public service benefits, and they only pay about $3,000 in taxes if they have, say, a $200,000 house and pay property taxes. How did we square that circle? We squared it on the backs of oil, gas, and coal. As those decline, we have a really tough problem. The first is we need to diversify our economy towards something else, and simultaneously, that's a big gamble. You never know if it's going to work. You have to take that leap of faith that as you move towards new ideas that they will be successful, but that's not always guaranteed. The second part is, if we want to maintain the public services that we have, then we are going to have to pay more for them individually. And so that means we're going to have to raise our taxes. That's really tough in a time when the economy is slowing down. Yeah, add on to that we have communities that are especially going to be hit by these transitions. And then you really see that, again, when there's a lack of resources available, because we're tied to energy and those are energy communities, the unfortunate fact is this is the worst possible time to be needing those resources. So what do we really need to do? We really do need to look forward, and we need to look honestly at what the future is. We have really tough challenges. We need to start talking about whether we are willing to pay more in taxes in this state to maintain our public services, how we care about those neighbors and how we are willing to support them, those neighbors who for years have helped generate those revenues that have supported the state. And we need to make those decisions with a clear eye on what's actually happening. There is often a lot of denial, or people just avoid talking about really difficult topics. And unfortunately, we just can't do that anymore. The current budget crisis that the state is facing has, we've run out of room to kick the old kick the can analogy. We've come to the end of the road. There's just we're now going to have to face the consequences that it's going to be costly to maintain services, to help neighbors, and are we willing to do the things we need to do to have the communities that we want? And the first decision that I talk about when I talk to people is, so what is the Wyoming that you want? We really probably have to have that fundamental conversation where we say, what are the communities that we want? What are the aspects of them that we want to keep and that we value? And then what will we need to keep those things? And then we need to form strategies around how we're going to achieve those goals. Trying to hold on to things that are disappearing, which is a natural kind of reaction, has happened and it's predictable, but we've kind of run out of time to do that. And so, like I said in my presentation, the clock is ticking. We now have to start talking about these problems. We've put it off too long, but they're really tough problems, and they're going to be really tough discussions. And so you can understand why people are both hesitant, especially in an election year, and at the same time uncertain, because none of us really have the answers. And so this is going to be a community-driven, statewide-driven effort where we try to figure out what we as Wyomingites want. And, you know, I think that those efforts have begun. The governor's office and the Power Wyoming effort is an example of that. That's the attempt. The problem is, in some ways, that events have kind of accelerated more quickly than we were expecting. And so that planning now has to really jump forward, because the problems that we thought were 5 or 10 years down the road are now right at our feet.
Yeah, that's a wonderful summary of the current state of Wyoming. And I've been involved in tax policy for a long time, and I really appreciate Rob, you, and Sharon in particular, who've spoken these truths, and hope that people really start listening and acting on them. Kurt, as you go around and see what things in Montana and things in Wyoming, I mean, what are people telling you about what they think is going to happen to these communities?
I think it's the fear of the unknown, the unknown change that's going to hit, the statewide impacts. For instance, in Montana, if you think coal is only going to impact Colstrip, you're in for a rude awakening. The same thing for Wyoming. If you think it's only going to impact Gillette or Kemmer or any of those funds are intertwined into budget in lots of different buckets in a budget for statewide. So I think, again, as I mentioned, I feel like I'm beating the same theme, but I think EDA is a tool in the toolbox to help try and be proactive and help lessen that blow. That's what I think the ACC, the Assistance to Coal Community Funding, is all about. And I'd love to see all of it go to Wyoming and Montana, because those are in my district. But I'm working with applicants right now to try and make that happen. But I think truly it's an opportunity. And like I said, I'm more than willing to help. My goal is trying to get as many dollars out of Denver to Wyoming and Montana as I can. So there's no bad question coming my direction.
Well, we appreciate that. Sharon, did you?
I just want to follow up on both Kirk and Rob's discussion, is that, you know, now is the time to really redefine the state's economy. You know, one of the ideas and some of the discussions we've had is, how can the state leverage companies that are already operating and invested in Wyoming? Because as we know, and Kirk's very familiar with, it's very tough to get an outside Fortune 50 or 100 company, the new company, to move into your state. We have some tremendously strong and invested companies that have done well in Wyoming. They're committed to Wyoming. I think it's an opportunity to leverage those companies to reinvest in the state. You know, Rocky Mountain Power, we've been here 107 years. We're looking at multi-billion-dollar investment in Wyoming, and we're here to stay. So I think there are other companies that feel the same way. They're willing to step up. And how will the state leverage that to help redefine the economic state here?
Right. Yeah, I think those are all the key factors that are playing in here. I think Monica is about to tell us that we've come to the end of our time. Are there any further comments that any of the three of you would like to make?
I have one. For us, we really are looking at this as an all of the above approach to energy development in Wyoming. It's not an either or. There will always be a place for base generation, thermal generation, natural gas and coal, but that shift in the pie, the way it looks now for generation is changing. So I think that we would all benefit from the all of the above approach to energy development in the state of Wyoming.
Kurt, do you have any closing words?
No, I think I kind of hit it on the last comment of any project coal related or anything else, job related, diversification, resiliency. I recommend thinking EDA and see if we can get more additional funding, I guess, into Wyoming.
Great. Okay, great. Well, thank you. Rob?
I guess I'd just say that we all know this. Wyoming is really at a crossroads, and while we face this difficult time of COVID-19 and the fears and concerns that we have of that, we can't forget that those other problems are still there, and it's an unfortunate reality. And the time is now. I'll just build on what I said just a second ago. We need to start talking about this stuff, and we need to start talking about it honestly. What is it that we want to see maintained in the state, preserved in the state? What are the things about Wyoming that we value most? And how are we going to work together? Recognizing that it'll be hard, but how are we going to work together? What are our priorities? What are we willing to accept as changes in this state to build a better Wyoming, is to use that old phrase. And I think that it's a tough time right now, but it's never an easy conversation. And the sooner we can start talking about that and about how we need to deal with not only energy, but with the fundamental challenges that our state faces, diversifying the economy, how we'll pay for public services, and what kind of state we want to leave for our kids. Those are the really important conversations that need to be had now. And so we're at a critical moment. And so while that's kind of scary, and Kirk said, change is something that people are uncomfortable with and often fear, we really do face an opportunity here. We have the opportunity to make a difference. And so what I hope is that people will step up, offer their time, offer their abilities, offer their opinion, and openly discuss this in a way that we can, in a way that will allow us to move forward. And so it's going to be tough, but the time is now. And so we might as well start thinking about it.
Well, thank you all. Great discussion, wonderful comments, really insightful and wonderful expertise. So, and thank you to all the participants. Thank you for the Powder River Basin Resources Council. We had, just a reminder, the second one of these webinars is next Thursday, June 25th. It's called Tools to Diversify Wyoming's Economy. You can go on the PRBR website and register for that. It's free, and join in that discussion. And then there are 2 more after that. So thank you all. Monica, is there anything else that we need to do?
Nope, that's it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
Monica, for your management. So, bye-bye. Thanks.